Hello and welcome to the ESOP Centre's 8th Share Plan Symposium. The event will be hosted by Baker McKenzie and I'm Juliet Wigthall and I manage the ESOP Centre at ZN Group. This is one of 9 presentations that will inform the 4 panel discussions at the in-person section of the symposium. This talk will be discussed as part of the panel on employee share plans in SMEs and private companies. Many thanks to Andrew Rink and David Walder of Bird & Bird, who will shortly tell us about growth share plans. There will be ample opportunity to put your questions and comments to the speakers at the symposium on the 5th of June, and we look forward to seeing you there. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Andrew and David.
Thank you. If we could move to the first slide, that'd be great. Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So, where do we start? What are growth shares? There's not too much magic about growth shares. They are simply a class of shares that only allow the holders to benefit from company value above a specified threshold or hurdle. And again, a hurdle is simply a provision in the waterfall of the company's articles that says that the growth shares will only participate in distributions made to shareholders once the non-growth shareholders have received distributions equal to the hurdle amount. So fairly straightforward, and it's worth saying at this point that it's worth distinguishing them from other types of similar arrangements out there, including things like flowering shares, where the holders participate in all of the proceeds, both above and below the hurdle, provided the hurdle is met. But flowering shares are slightly outside the remit of this presentation. You will hear us mention them once or twice, but we're not proposing to go into them in detail. We're dealing here with classic growth shares, and when you're looking at growth shares, the defining characteristic really is this hurdle. And the really important thing about the hurdle, there are a couple of important things. One, the hurdle can be used to control the upfront value of the shares, and this is, we'll come on to this, but particularly useful for companies with high share valuations. And the way the hurdle can be leveraged to basically set it higher and higher and higher until you get to what is an acceptable upfront value of the shares, at which point it becomes affordable to employees. And this avoids them having to put in a significant amount of money up front or pay a sort of a significant immediate tax charge on their acquisition, which is generally one of the biggest barriers to employee equity ownership. So growth shares, the hurdle is also useful for protecting existing shareholders from value dilution. Essentially, the growth shareholders will only benefit from growth in the company value above that value, so they won't immediately acquire sort of unearned or historic value like they would if they were just acquiring ordinary shares. So that's what distinguishes growth shares from just an everyday sort of common direct share acquisition. Now, with growth shares, the next point, these are tax motivated. So tax is a very important point here. But unlike things like EMI options, CSO options, where they have a special tax regime, there's no special growth share tax regime per se. They're taxed like normal share acquisitions for employees. So as a general refresher, that means there's income tax and potentially PAYE and NICS and apprenticeship levy and all those things, if they're ready first passes on any discount at acquisition. So if the employee acquires the shares and pays less than the market value of the shares when they acquire them, that discount is going to be subject to an employee tax charge. There could also be a restricted securities charge, although this restricted security regime will apply unless the Section 431 election is entered into. And if a 431 election is entered into, then obviously the tax on the acquisition will be by reference to the discount against the unrestricted market value of the shares. If the alternative, if a 431 is forgotten about or not entered into, the restricted securities regime will apply, and you could have post-acquisition employment tax charges on lifting or variation of restrictions that get commonly on the disposal of the shares. Obviously, that's generally not the approach taken or wanted for growth shares. So 431 election will be entered into, take out of the restricted securities regime, and the net result is that it should be possible for all gains to be subject to capital gains tax and not income tax. That means they are potentially very tax efficient awards, especially for employees who pay a higher or additional rate of income tax. And you get a not dissimilar tax outcome to EMI or CSOP. And the other thing is probably worth mentioning on tax is that the restricted security regime likes apply, but convertible securities regime should not generally apply if they're structured correctly. But it's certainly one to be aware of, especially if you're dealing with Flowery shares or something a bit closer to that. Generally, HMRC does accept that if both regimes could apply, that the restricted securities regime should be preferential, and they won't seek to apply an alternative charge so long as taxpayers are consistent. But these growth shares, the idea is to structure them correctly. We'll come on to that, and structure them correctly so they fall into fully into just the normal treatment and CGT for on the gain in value after acquisition. And I alluded to it earlier. One of the nice things about growth shares is that they don't have so many statutory conditions to satisfy, certainly in the same way that EMI and CSOP options do, and that gives a good deal of flexibility in their commercial setup. They can be used for employees and non-employees, so NEDs and the consultant awards, and when it comes to actually drafting things like the hurdle and the commercial terms, again, there's quite a bit of flexibility if that's desired. And at the bottom of the slide, we've put down 3 use cases where growth shares are commonly used. It's not to say they don't have greater application, they certainly do, and we see them coming up in lots of different scenarios. But those 3 are probably sort of some of the most common use cases for growth shares. First, you've got unlisted companies that do not meet the conditions for tax advantage share options, so things like EMI and CSOP. And that could be because the company's gone through the EMI gross assets limit, or where the individual limits have been used up. At that point, the company will have been granting options for a while. They'll be used to handing out tax advantaged awards to their employees, and the employees will be used to getting them. When they find they can no longer use those tax advantage options, they're faced with the prospect of, do you move to non-tax advantage awards and suddenly pay a lot of income tax and NICs, or do you look elsewhere? And often one of the first and the most logical next steps will be to move to growth shares. They're also useful for non-employee awards, I mentioned, and especially where you want to apply some sort of consistency to what you're giving to both employees and non-employees. It's useful to have something that can be granted to both. Again, growth shares can fit the bill. And finally, companies with a high share price. Now, the higher the share price gets, the more challenges you generally have with equity awards, because you just have less latitude in what you can offer. Things like EMI, CSOP can rapidly become not viable because the limits become quite restrictive. Non-growth shares, just direct acquisitions of sort of ordinary shares will rapidly become unaffordable, and frankly, most employees and often a lot of service providers won't be willing to stump up such a large amount to begin with. So, when share prices go up, it's good from a business perspective, but it does prompt a company to think about how they're going to keep their service provider equity arrangements competitive. And growth shares, again, are a logical and very appropriate next step often. Could we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Key considerations for growth shares. There's obviously a lot of a lot of things will be fact specific, but generally, we've put some points on the board that you will generally want to always be thinking about with growth shares. First up is valuation. Valuation is absolutely crucial here. It's fundamental to making growth shares work, and both from securing the tax treatment you want and also from making the whole incentivization mechanic viable. Now, therefore, it's crucial to reliably ascertain the initial value of the shares before you issue anything, before you get started. You need to plan it out and think what will be the day one value of these shares when they're acquired. This, as I said, it underpins the tax treatment because fundamentally, assuming you sign Section 431 election, which nearly always will be done, and nearly always is the best idea, then you'll need to pay you need to know what the restricted market value is in order to pay that amount and understand the tax position for the individual. This is also going to be an area of scrutiny on any due diligence application, due diligence exercise, and therefore it's pretty much essential to understand that valuation and to get professional advice on it. So that means a third-party independent valuator that knows what they're looking at and can tell you with some certainty what the valuation is. And the reason that's particularly important with growth shares is that, unlike with things like EMI and CSOC, which often companies would have been dealing with up to that point, HMRC will not give its approval to the valuation of directly issued growth shares. And so you really are in the position of having to take a view, and you want that to be an informed view, which is why we certainly always recommend a professional valuator gets involved to give their opinion. There is a slight nuance there, which Andrew's going to come on to, that you can grant EMI CSOP options over growth shares, and one of the advantages of that is the HMRC valuation approved, but we'll cover that in more detail in a subsequent slide. So that's why we go with, why valuation is important and why we approach the way we do. Obviously valuation then begs the question, what will be the valuation? How do you work it out? And it's been the case for a number of years now that HMRC has made it clear that it doesn't accept current year basis of valuation anymore for what is that share worth to just right now. Is it looking at is it in the money or not? And they must instead have a forward-looking methodology that takes into account essentially the expected returns on that share. That broadly equates to what do we see in practice? We're seeing much more scrutiny on nominal valuations. So though we do occasionally see them in certain cases, especially where, say, hurdles are exceptionally challenging, generally they will be picked up and queried by advisors, and companies should not expect anymore to be getting nominal valuations for growth shares in the ordinary course. Now, the next point we've got there is it's a hurdle. Obviously, as I said, this is a defining characteristic of growth shares. They need careful design. So when you're going through implementing, you do need to think through exactly how they're going to work and need to be implemented into the company's constitutional documents appropriately. And again, we'll cover that in the next couple of slides. But the general position is hurdles. There's quite a bit of flexibility with these. It's very, very common to use an absolute figure, say X number of pounds or whatever will be the X number of pounds per share will be the hurdle. But we've also seen more variety in hurdles, including things like growing, also accumulating value, growth shares for year-on-year values. There are different things that can be done here to meet a company's commercial needs. And that's fundamentally what is important here. It's about balancing affordability of the shares for the employees with what is commercially realistic and viable for the individual. And the hurdle really is where those things meet. You could set the hurdle really, really, really high, get a really cheap share, but if that's not going to ever be achievable for the company, the shares won't ever return anything, and the incentivization effects then will just completely be undermined or totally diminished. So there's always that balance, and the company is actually in the best position to comment on what it thinks works for its business and its prospects, and then working with the valuator, you can then set the hurdle at an appropriate level to give the total value shares at the level that you want. Now, a slightly more technical point on hurdles, which you see on the screen, the rights that must attach to shares and be intrinsic to the shares. That broadly means that they must persist if those shares are transferred to a third party. They're not sort of restrictions on the individual shareholder themselves. The reason is if they're not intrinsic, the tax regime that I laid out before may not apply, and so this is, as I say, it's a technical point, but it's one that's very important to get right. It's largely a question of how it's implemented. Are the rights in the correct places in the constitutional documents? And again, Andrew's going to cover that shortly, so I won't jump the gun on that. The remaining points on the screen, Section 41 election, again, I've touched on this. It's just the underlying point is just don't forget this. You can either do it before the shares are acquired or within 14 days of them being acquired. But if you miss that deadline, it can't then be done. So you just have to do it, or else risk that employment tax charges may arise post acquisition, which is just not the situation you want. And the fourth point there, how will the growth shares be paid for? This is really quite important, and it's a major difference to options. So it's a major difference to what often companies and the individuals getting these shares will be used to up to that point. Options, there's no upfront acquisition cost. With growth shares, they are shares that are acquired on day one, and so there is an immediate liability for the recipient. And how they're paid for you, there are different ways, forms of payment. You can use cash, loans, the price can be left outstanding. But what doesn't change is the fact that from day one, the recipient will have a liability that's crystallized and exists. And what you then get into when you're thinking about what form of payment should be used, it's going to be fact specific, but factors like valuation and what's acceptable to the company will weigh in on this. Valuation, the higher the valuation, the less likely employees are to pay in cash just because of affordability. Companies and investors may have views on whether the company should be giving out loans or leaving purchase price outstanding. These are all things that need to be addressed ahead of issuing the shares, because obviously you can't get the shares into people's hands until the shares are actually paid for. There are further subsidiary considerations of things like loans and notional loans. There are tax implications and complexity around documenting it and reporting it. That's slightly more detail than we had to go in on this presentation, but certainly cash is probably the simplest way of doing it, but not always viable just because of the outlay that's required from individuals. And if you then do get into the realm of having to offer or think about loans and outstanding purchase prices, then you do have to understand and make sure both the company and recipient understand their obligations there. There's another very important commercial consideration here around leaver provisions. These aren't unique to growth shares by any stretch. All employee and service provider equity arrangements will have leaver provisions attached to them. Growth shares are no different. And it's the common thing to think of here. Can leavers retain the shares? Must they sell them back to the company? Or must they relinquish them somehow? How many of the shares are they entitled to retain? Must they sell? And at what price is that done. Again, this, because it probably isn't going to be new to a company when they're first looking at growth shares. They'll probably have seen lever provisions before and other arrangements, but the key considerations are do they have a sort of standard set of lever provisions that apply across their equity incentive arrangements, in which things like EMI, CSOP options, if they've previously offered those, in which case it might be good to align, broadly align with those lever provisions, also to reflect those lever provisions in the terms of the growth shares. Generally, with growth shares, what we see is the goal is to, as is generally the case, to treat good levers well. And that manifests normally as sort of a repurchase of vested shares at the higher of fair market value of the subscription price, so that the individual doesn't lose their earned value. But also to protect the company, so that will be provisions like bad levers or unvested shares repurchased at the lower of subscription price and fair market value, just so that the individual doesn't unfairly benefit from stuff they haven't technically earned to that point. Obviously, there is no general requirement or rule as to what those provisions should state, so those are very much within the gift of the company to tailor to its sort of preference and its specific circumstances. The one interesting sort of say smaller point of practice, if with lever provisions, if the individual has acquired through, let's say, a loan, and there is a question of whether the company should be aware when it's structuring the lever mechanism, at least to think about whether it's going to leave employees with a liability on that loan after all of these repurchases have been done. And that may be what the company wants. It might not be, but it's not something you want to be surprised by after the fact. So something that should be considered at the outset when structuring lever conditions, alongside the sort of the purchase mechanics. The next point, business asset disposal relief. Again, this is slightly more minor consideration of growth shares, because there's no relaxed rules unless you're using EMI options, and so the holder must satisfy the normal tests, including holding 5% ordinary share capital and voting rights. And so it can, in practice, be quite hard for growth shareholders to satisfy the conditions of business asset disposal relief if they're getting directly issued growth shares, unless they're a major holder in the company. So again, it's one to be aware of, but it's not always the case that a growth shareholder will get business asset disposal relief. And we've put listed companies up there. I mean, we've already mentioned that unlisted companies do tend to use growth shares a fair bit, and I think it's true to say, and it's probably fair to say they're a bit more unusual for listed companies. Occasionally you do see growth shares used at a subsidiary level in a listed company, so there'll be growth shares over subsidiary shares, but with a flip up on an exit. But there are various sort of barriers to doing that, and not least convincing the shareholders of the value or the appropriateness of doing that. So when we see growth shares much more in an unlisted or private company context. And finally, non-UK participants. Increasingly, UK companies can have a diverse worldwide spread of employed in many jurisdictions around the world, and granting equity to employed service providers. The assumption can often be made that by a company that just wants to grant the same thing to everybody, for consistency and ease of rollout. But you should never assume that growth shares will work in all non-UK jurisdictions. It's very much a UK tax mechanic. Some jurisdictions they do work in, but others, including the US, are not particularly viable in at all. So it's just very important to take local advice before issuing outside of the UK.
Yeah, so go to the next slide, please. So yes, so to implement the growth shares, as David mentioned, you have to update your constitutional documents, your articles of association. So this is where you would set out the hurdle and how the mechanics for it work. So just briefly, I mean, there's different ways of doing this. They're often so at the basic level, you can either set a default hurdle amount, and that would then specify the hurdle that the growth shares must reach before they can participate in any proceeds. And then a subscription agreement or something else may seek to then change that for if the value of the company increases. I mean, an alternative would be to have different subclasses of growth shares for um, each time that a new set of growth shares is issued and the value has gone up. So you could have growth A shares for the base valuation, and then B, C, and so on. And then the hurdle can then be set either by reference to a per share price or a global company valuation. And the distinction is quite important there, because if it's on a per share price, it could take into account any sort of future investment. So if there was an investment round at the same price, then the growth shares would still be having to participate above that hurdle. Whereas if it was on a global hurdle, an investment would increase the company's value, and then it would make it easier for the growth shares to participate without actually necessarily having done it. You see some companies go with the global hurdle because they consider that the growth share participants are participating and contributing to bring in that extra investment amount. In terms of key other drafting points to consider, there's whether you have voting or dividend rights for the growth shares. Often we see, because they want to mirror option arrangements, there isn't no voting or dividend rights are ascribed to growth shares, so that they don't participate as options wouldn't participate in dividends and voting. When the where, for the where the growth shares participate, that's often set out in the liquidation preference. So that will set out that on a distribution of assets, the growth shares will participate above the hurdle. So I think one thing to be very mindful of is if the company is SEIS, EIS eligible, and they have investment, and all those shares haven't passed their relevant termination date, or they want to raise EIS funds in the future. If you just do it, that the ordinary shares participate below the hurdle and the growth shares participate above it, that would be a disqualifying preference for EIS purposes. So in those circumstances, you'd have to carefully draft so that there would be a small proportion that the growth shares are entitled to beneath the hurdle, to not create a preference which is accepted practice. And then, as David mentioned, you actually have to pay the subscription price, and you are acquiring shares on day one. So in that situation, you'd be having a subscription agreement to acquire the shares and then pay the subscription price. They can be done in different ways. I mean, the whole purpose of growth shares is to reduce the subscription price to an affordable amount. So if you aren't paying the unrestricted market value on acquisition, that would be paid under the subscription agreement. That should not result in any tax liabilities. But if there is a discount to that subscription price, you'd be having a tax liability on day one. I mean, alternative arrangements would be if it's a real value subscription price for the company, to loan that amount to the participants, or you could leave it as an amount outstanding. But the risk with leaving an amount outstanding is that if the shares go down in value, you are still obliged to pay that. So you could be losing money on these shares. For leavers, then you would include in the subscription agreement often a mechanic to buy back the shares, and that would often be take the place of a call option, whereby if a person leaves, the shares can be bought back, and then that can be tailored. We often see vesting schedules replicated as option agreements, so that they vest over a period of time, and if they left, say in the fourth year, the company would buy back unvested shares for good leaver and all shares for bad leavers, and the price can then be dictated again in that agreement with a fair value for good leavers or a nominal price for bad leavers. We'd often have also a power of attorney if there were a sale of the company, to allow the director of the company to sell the growth shares on behalf of the participants. This is it makes it a cleaner way than relying on the drag and tag provisions in the articles. And then finally on this slide, because the growth share participants are actually acquiring the shares, they'd be registered in the register of members and then on company sales. So we often see companies wanting to put a nominee arrangement in place so that the nominee would acquire the shares, the legal title, but the beneficial title would still be owned by the participants, so that the names and entitlements aren't freely available on company's house. So if we go to the next slide, please. Great. So, I mean, where a company hasn't actually breached the EMI limits and is still eligible to give EMI and CSOP options, there is a possibility since the CSOP rules were changed back in April 2023, you can now grant EMI and CSOP options over growth shares. And there are quite a few advantages to this, because say if your ordinary share has a real value and your growth share value is reduced for the reasons we've discussed, you can actually grant more shares than you would otherwise be able to. So if there was a particular person who had an EMI grant of say £240,000, then to continue to benefit from the EMI treatment, you can grant EMI options over those growth shares, and that can really stretch the limit for particular. And we often do see that in situations where founders or the like are close to the limit and want to continue to be incentivized by additional share option awards. I mean, another advantage is that you can, with HMRC, get a valuation, because you can only nowadays get valuations with approved valuations under a tax advantage scheme. So it provides a certain level of certainty that you wouldn't otherwise do under a straight up subscription. And then it helps with, you don't actually have to pay any money up front. There's no subscription price to pay. If it's an exit only scheme, for example, you can do a cashless exercise. So that the subscription price, the exercise price can be deducted from the subscription price, from the sale proceeds, and that there shouldn't be a risk of a drawing tax charge, provided that you've granted them at or above the market value on grant. So and then similarly, it helps leavers manage easily, because instead of having to go through the process of actually buying back the shares, the options can simply lapse and the option falls away. And then the other advantages of EMI options, share options of corporation tax deduction, so the difference between the exercise price and the market value on exercise, the company can get a corporation tax deduction for that. And then, because you wouldn't normally have the 5% entitlements required for a business asset disposal relief, the growth share options, EMI options over growth shares can benefit from the business asset disposal relief relaxation. So you can actually potentially get BADR if you meet all the other conditions. The disadvantages are that potentially participants might not understand what the difference between an option over a growth share and an option over a ordinary share, and the distinction between the two, and that because they have an exercise price and then a hurdle on top, they might just think, oh, I've paid this exercise price for the growth share. However, that can be explained to the participant. And you've got to make sure that the company and the individual both satisfy the relevant conditions for EMI and CSOP options. It is an extra layer of drafting, and you've got to make sure that the relevant plan rules allow for more than one share class to be in place and options granted over that share. So, because if the option plan specifically says only ordinary shares, there might need to be considerations as to whether that needs to be updated. And it's not as flexible. You can't choose who can participate as with just a standard subscription agreement because of the EMI and the CSOP conditions. So if we can go to the final slide, please. So yes, so what can go wrong? So if we have, as David mentioned about the importance of a Section 431 election, so if there's missing or is incorrect, and when it comes to sell the shares, if you can't find it and the unrestricted market value hasn't been paid up front on acquisition, there is a potential for an income tax charge, because they would argue that the difference between actual market value and unrestricted, which may increase during the life of the shares, would then be subject to income tax. Similarly, if the shares fall in value, you have a share that's worth less than either, say, what you've paid for, so you make a loss, or if there are loan arrangements outstanding, so there was a real share price, the company's loaned you that amount, and you then either have to pay that whole loan back and then have shares worth less than that, or if the company then writes it off and you're an employee or officer, you can then have an income tax charge on that amount of write-off. Or if you've left a balance outstanding on acquisition, again, you either have to pay that amount back, or if the company pays you, that could potentially be taxable.
Yeah, we've put some other points of that on the board as well. I mean, the issues in implementation often, probably the majority of challenges I certainly see with growth shares fundamentally come down to whether the valuation was correct, and it challenges that basically the valuation should have been actually higher than the company considered it at the time, and therefore less than market value was paid for the shares, and that's amplified if there isn't a 4-1 election, as Andrew said. But the way to get around that, get professional advice. Something that could be stood behind a third-party independent valuation is going to be a good defence against that kind of challenge by other, but on a due diligence exercise, or if HMRC was to challenge it. And it could also help with the penalties position if HMRC did see that advice was taken by the company from a qualified valuator. We also see issues around the actual implementation of the hurdle. So has it been drafted into the articles correctly? I've even seen the incorrect hurdle applied, especially whether there's a default hurdle in the articles, and the company meant to put a higher hurdle in but forgot to properly reverse that high hurdle, and then the default one takes over, and that obviously then goes on to change the valuation of the shares. So there are things to be mindful of, and all the EIS, SEIS impact that Andrew mentioned. Again, these things can be generally headed off by taking proper advice, getting a professional to prepare the amendments to the articles, prepare the growth share documentation. We'll a slightly more minor one, but I've come across some clients who, especially when they've been doing options for years and years, when it comes to doing growth shares, they have a bit of a blind spot as to not being aware that growth shares do in fact need, certainly growth shares acquired by employees and office holders of the company do fall within the employment-related securities reporting regime, and therefore do need to be reported to HMRC. The penalties are financial rather than invalidating the actual growth share themselves, so there's fairly limited repercussions from that, but it's still something that the company should always be aiming to get right, to have a good compliance record. I think the final thing that is a bit more nebulous, but the final thing I see going wrong with growth shares is that they are trickier to understand than options. They're often there's less about them in the general awareness of employees in companies. They just don't encounter them so often. So when a company starts talking about rolling them out, they can sometimes miss the mark. Employees don't understand what they're getting. They think they're getting something more than they are, or they think they're getting something less than they are. And the thing about incentivization and equity incentivizations, they only work and they only have that incentivization effect if the person getting them really understands them. So there has to be sort of a PR exercise that goes with them to make sure everyone really understands what they are, what their obligations are, and what the potential benefit is if everything goes well, and then they can really have a great effect, both in terms of incentivizing a service providers, but also really getting value into people's hands in a very tax efficient way. That brings us to the end of the session. So thank you very much from both of us for joining and listening in. I think also thank you from the ESOP Centre to all of its members for their support. So you see all the members on the board now. And just I think the final thing to say is that obviously next Thursday, 5th of June, we've got the in-person symposium. If anybody wants to ask any questions, they would be delighted to answer them. And we look forward to seeing everyone there next week. Thank you.